Hey there guys, Godly Seafood here. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I like to watch versus battles by content creators like Swag Kage, Sick, some of his friends, and was just kind of thinking to myself a couple weeks ago, hey, why don't I make this exact same type of content, but with something that actually has a little bit more relevance to what I do and the content that I make. And after talking to a good friend of mine and just kind of spitballing some thoughts here and there, we kind of decided that, the Tartarus trio, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, would make a pretty interesting starter video. Not only is there a lot to cover with those particular three, but there are also multiple different versions of these three, and ultimately I think it would be a really cool idea to kind of explore. So for the purpose of making things simple, I'm going to be putting in some parameters in place and making some base assumptions throughout the fight. As interesting as I think it would be to have all the different versions of each boss fight each other at the same time in a battle royale type situation, I just don't have the ability to process how that fight would even go. I'm going to be taking into account how I think the King's Isle AI would do in each fight based on my own personal experience, and be making some assumptions on things that I think aren't as clear and how I think they would end up playing out. I'm going to mostly be going off of the Wizard101 wiki when it comes to comparing each boss's stats, cheats, and cards. There are some cheats that bosses have access to, but they rely on being triggered by other bosses that won't be in the fight, so I'm not going to include those. When it comes to spells, I'm only going to be talking about the versions shown on the wiki. No hypothetical, enchant, or mutate spells, just the cards as shown on the wiki. And lastly, keep in mind this is my own personal interpretation. Nothing is set in stone when it comes to these rankings. If you think a certain boss would do better than how I think they would, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Coming in at the bottom of the list is the level 30 Mount Olympus version of Zeus. I don't think anybody needs to be told why Zeus is placed this low. He's quite literally the weakest of all of the different versions of the Immortals. It's not even a competition. Compared to every other boss, Zeus has the least amount of health and does the least amount of damage due to the fact that he doesn't even have crit block or crit. When going up against the level 70 Aquila version of Poseidon, he gets stomped on. Even though Zeus technically has a 35% myth boost, he's still hopelessly outmatched due to the aforementioned reasons above. When compared to the Tartarus and Exalted versions, it's not even fair. The Mount Olympus version of Zeus gets blitzed. The Tartarus versions only need about 4 to 6 hits to actually kill him, and the Exalted versions only need about 2 to 4. Like I said before, there's no competition. He goes purely at the bottom. He is the weakest of the weak in this version. As for the runner-up for last place, the level 70 Atlantia version of Poseidon is a slightly different story compared to the Mount Olympus version of Zeus. The only boss on this list Atlantia Poseidon manages to beat outright is Olympus Zeus, for obvious reasons. When compared to the other bosses, Atlantia Poseidon does have a similar health range, however, does not manage to have enough damage necessary to defeat the others. The only other enemies I see Atlantia Poseidon being able to keep up with would be his Tartarus counterpart and maybe even Tartarus Zeus, but even then, Atlantia Poseidon is at a major disadvantage. Every other boss on this list has the ability to use 2 schools of magic and tends to have mastery with those schools as well, meaning that when facing the Tartarus versions, Atlantia Poseidon can't rely solely on his storm resist to keep him alive. Tartarus Hades will undoubtedly manage to pull out an easy win, and again, the Exalted versions aren't really even a fight. It's not even fair. These guys, the Exalted versions, I'll talk about them later, but they are just absolutely fucking insane. From here on out, the fights start to get a whole lot more interesting. The Tartarus versions and the Exalted versions are somewhat relative to one another, but ultimately end up staying in their respective groupings. Getting into the Tartarus groupings, I would have to say that the weakest of the trio would have to be Zeus. The decision to place him this low mostly comes from his moveset and stats compared to his Tartarus counterparts. Each one of the Tartarus Immortals do seem to have the ability to boost against one another with at least half their deck set up, but aside from that, Zeus doesn't have much else going for him compared to the other two. When going up against Hades, all of Zeus's interference spells are relatively worthless. Hades can't be stunned or beguiled and can even heal himself back by using drain spells. Hades can also debuff Zeus to do less damage or even fizzle, and can rely on stacking Curse and Hex rather than just relying on blades that can easily get taken out by a well-timed earthquake. Overall, I can see Hades coming out on top more often than Zeus. When fighting Poseidon, it's a similar story. Zeus is immediately handicapped by Poseidon's storm resistance and Poseidon's ability to cast Tower Shield on himself. Zeus does have quite a lot of shield breakers in his arsenal. However, Poseidon tends to outdamage Zeus with storm spells that boost against Zeus and ice spells that Zeus has no resistance against. Both Zeus and Poseidon do have the ability to run interference with spells like Earthquake and Leviathan to remove potential blades, and stun each other to buy more time and build up pips. The main determining factor in this fight would have to be Poseidon's overpowered crit block chance. Though there's no specific stat on the wiki to show what amount of crit block he actually has, almost every person who's ever fought these guys will tell you that Poseidon tends to crit block a whole lot more often than the other two. Whereas I know Poseidon's ability to remove traps isn't a factor in this fight, I still feel like Zeus is just barely outdone by Poseidon's damage and survivability more often than not. Like I said, the Tartarus bosses are all pretty relative to one another, so if I had to guess who would be the most likely to win in a fight, I don't think Zeus can consistently beat the other two. Next on the list would have to be Hades. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who understand just how OP drain spells can be, but hear me out. Given my previous arguments, I do think that Hades could beat Zeus pretty consistently due to being able to trap stack rather than just rely on blades. And also, Hades just doesn't have the ability to be stunned, leaving Zeus with not a whole lot of versatility in that fight. Poseidon, however, is a bit of a different story. Against Poseidon, yes, Hades cannot be stunned. And yes, Poseidon does not boost on Hades at all. However, the same exact thing applies to Hades. Hades does not have the ability to boost on Poseidon or stun him, putting them in a similar range of survivability. The main thing for Hades is that in order for his drain spells to be super effective, he needs to be able to deal out a lot of damage. Otherwise, he's just going to be gaining about 300 to 500 health per drain hit depending on if he crits or not. Typically, that wouldn't be an issue, however, his ability to blades are somewhat limited due to Poseidon's ability to remove them with Leviathan. Furthermore, anytime Hades places a trap on Poseidon, Poseidon will counter with a cheat, casting his natural attack which removes traps and deals roughly 400 to 600 damage to Hades. With Hades' main survivability factor gone, the only other thing he can rely on to reduce Poseidon's damage would be Virulent Plague. Even with that, I don't see Hades being able to outlast Poseidon. Like I mentioned earlier, Poseidon seems to possess a higher chance to crit block, which lands him quite a bit of survivability, and with Tower Shield on his side, I think the interference aspect of the fight is mostly cancelled out. One thing I will say is that Hades does have a few shield breakers in his deck, but they all tend to cost a lot of pips, and I just don't see him being able to win against Poseidon's insane durability. Honestly, it's the only reason I put Poseidon this high is the fact that the devs just seem to have given him quite a lot of crit block, and it's just unfair. Ask anybody who's ever fought the Tartarus trio, and you'll probably hear a lot of people say that aside from Poseidon not being able to be trapped by conventional means, he tends to just crit block outright. Getting into the level 100 Exalted Challenge versions, it's a completely different ballgame. If you thought that the difference between a level 30 Zeus versus a level 70 Poseidon was a bit excessive, it's fucking insane just how big of a power gap there is between the Tartarus versions and the Exalted versions. I don't know what it was about King's Isle around this time of Wiz's development, but they went ham when it came to any Exalted level enemy. The Exalted bosses are on a completely different level. Not only do they start off with a base stat of 25% universal pierce, they also have updated spells as well as shadow spells, and their cheats seem to have been improved as well, at least for most of them. So when it comes to the Exalted versions, a lot seems to have changed for Poseidon. He mostly has storm hits with the exception of 2 other hits, but one of them is locked behind the requirement of needing a shadow pip to cast. On top of that, his OP crit block ability seems to have completely gone out the window. Furthermore, Poseidon seems to have lost his ability to use his natural attack as a cheat. Poseidon's natural attack removes any traps on him as well as dealing damage to his opponents. Now, that spell is still a part of his deck setup, however, because it's no longer a cheat, it basically limits his ability to deal damage and lowers his durability quite a bit. One thing he does have going for him, however, is his ability to cheat cast Enfeeble, as well as cheat cast a version of Snow Shark that is an AoE and steals a pip from his enemies, which makes the fight between him and Hades a little bit closer. But overall, I see Hades being able to outdamage and outlast Poseidon more often than not. Hades has a myriad of cheats that can whittle away his opponents, if not just get rid of shields almost entirely, as well as negate his enemy's ability to heal. Even though Poseidon doesn't heal, Hades has a lot of high damage single hits, most of which are drain spells that allow him to heal back, as well as do a lot of damage up front. And again, Hades does also have the ability to debuff Poseidon using Virulent Plague. Under the right circumstances, Hades could easily pierce through most of Poseidon's shields, only losing 5% damage when taking into account his 25% universal pierce, as well as potentially stacking that with his dragon spear, which now does 20% universal pierce as well. Like I said earlier, the only reason I put Poseidon over Hades in the Tartarus groupings was because of Poseidon's crazy durability. However, this time his durability has been taken away almost completely, landing him overall at 3rd place in my books. When it comes to Zeus, I think it's close, but not quite as close as it was with Hades. Poseidon does have a 35% chance to boost on Zeus with all of his storm hits, and can even take advantage of one of Zeus's healing cheats. Anytime Zeus is hit with an AoE, Zeus will cheat cast a healing current on the AoE caster. However, like I mentioned earlier in the rules, unless a cheat is specifically a pairing cheat, I'm not going to consider that cheat capable of triggering other cheats. So Poseidon's ability to cheat cast Snow Shark doesn't really gain him any additional heals in the fight. The main thing that causes Poseidon to lose in this fight is Zeus's durability and outgoing damage compared to Poseidon. Zeus has a cheat where every time he's hit with a single target spell, he will shift Minotaur and deal 310 myth damage, and another cheat that at the beginning of every 5th round, Zeus will cheat cast a version of Wrath of Zeus, dealing 995 storm damage as an AoE while casting Astrophobia. Now, Astrophobia is a pretty interesting spell because Zeus and Poseidon both have the ability to gain 20% storm crit and 20% storm pierce. However, the pierce is pretty much wasted on Poseidon while giving Zeus a bit of an edge in the fight. Unlike Poseidon, Zeus has no storm resist whatsoever, so the extra pierce doesn't really help Poseidon at all. However, this allows Zeus to gain more damage output for at least half of his deck. Another cheat Poseidon has is that when an enemy uses an aura, Poseidon will cheat cast a tower shield on his opponent, thereby limiting Poseidon's ability to do damage even further. For me, this fight is just another case of Exalted Poseidon not having the durability to consistently compete with his opponent's damage output and survivability. Taking 2nd place on this list is going to be Exalted Zeus. Obviously, I just mentioned that I think Exalted Zeus could beat Exalted Poseidon, so I'm just going to dive into the fight between Exalted Zeus and Exalted Hades. Originally, I had intended for Zeus to be the overall winner, but after taking a deeper look into Hades' cheats and deck setup, I think Zeus just narrowly loses. This is probably the closest fight between all of them because both enemies have the ability to reduce each other's damage through interference spells like Earthquake and Virulent Plague, while also being able to compensate for those losses. Zeus specifically has the ability to cleanse himself, while Hades has access to at least one trap to get around Earthquake, as well as having almost all drain spells that deal boosted damage and give him a fair amount of survivability. Getting into the cheats, Zeus actually has to worry about 2 potential AoEs this time, with both of them being drain spells, Scarecrow and Call of Cthulhu. So anytime these spells are used, Hades will be getting back half the damage dealt as HP, as well as Zeus giving him a nice little 400 to 700 healing current from his cheat. Yeah, healing current can heal up to 700 health. It's actually a pretty OP healing spell. Furthermore, anytime Zeus attempts to heal, Hades will cheat cast a minus 90% version of Infection, making Zeus's potential next heal worthless. Getting into their pairing cheats, Zeus starts off first with casting an Earthquake at the beginning of every 5th round, dealing 630 myth damage and removing all wards and charms. Hades will follow up by casting a version of Lernean Hydron, which is an AoE that deals 640 fire damage, 545 ice damage, or 795 storm damage. However, because this is a cheat, I'm not going to be considering this AoE capable of activating Zeus's healing current cheat. With all that said, I think Zeus has a sizable amount of damage, but overall, his healing cheat paired with Hades' survivability causes him to not be able to outlast Hades in my opinion. That leaves Exalted Hades as the overall winner in my book. Compared to the others, his cheat spells and durability allow him enough time to outlast his opponents and overall win the fight. Overall, this is a really fun project to do. There's a whole lot of information to skim through on the wiki, and I'd be surprised if I actually managed to get everything right. Not to mention, just with the amount of cheats that some of the later bosses have, it's pretty hard to come to an interpretation that can set in stone what all cheats would work and what wouldn't, as well as other people will inevitably come to different conclusions. I'm not saying that any of my own personal interpretations are correct. This is just the way that I see it based off the information that I have, either through stuff I was able to find on the wiki or personal experience. If you like the video, give it a like, and if you think that the order could somehow be mixed up a little bit due to whatever factors, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. And if you guys like seeing this sort of stuff, let me know. Maybe I'll make more of these in the future. I was just pretty interested in doing something about Tartarus while going into questing into Tartarus, and I don't know, I just thought this would be a whole lot of fun.
No, I keep pissing.